Well, thank you for inviting me here, and thank you as well for allowing me to do my presentation in English. Much appreciated. So this is a case study of Amsterdam and what the city administration and other parties are currently doing to try to manage the regrowth that's occurring right now. I've placed post-pandemic here in parentheses because obviously if you're in China at the moment, the pandemic has not ended. But in the Netherlands, we have started acting as if it has. So I'll be talking about what's happening in the city as tourists start to come back in significant numbers. Amsterdam is the city where I live, but it's also a very significant one for looking at these issues because it was one of the places that experienced very strongly and very publicly issues of overtourism before the pandemic. And this is due to very substantial increases in the number of tourists that had started to arrive. Somewhere on the order of 20 million tourists per year came as of 2019, and this is a city with less than 1 million inhabitants, so quite a significant number. But it was also one of the places that in the midst of the pandemic was very vocal about trying to ensure that as tourists came back, that we wouldn't return to the same situation as before. The administration was very vocal about this. There was a lot of news coverage of their plans to change things dramatically, and there was a lot of planning for the return of tourists afterwards. What has actually happened in practice, though, has been less than what was initially hoped or intended. So I'll be discussing that as well. Okay? And so we're lucky in this situation to have conducted research empirically both before the pandemic to understand the dominant approach to tourism management then, and then also in previous spring of 2021, just as tourists was starting to live. We're still waiting now to hear what happened this past summer, especially in terms of the numbers of tourists coming back, because that will have a significant impact on policy in the future, as I'll explain. So I'm doing this presentation on behalf of one of my students, Lola Kunin, who I developed this presentation with, but also on behalf of a larger group of colleagues that have contributed to this research project. So the larger context first. You're all familiar with this right now, the specter of over-tourism, very strongly in Amsterdam as in other places up until the crisis. And one of the responses to problems of tourism growth then was growing calls, as we've heard before, for the possibility of moving away from growth altogether in pursuit of sustainable degrowth. This was most vocal, of course, in Barcelona, but was also a discussion in other places. And increasingly, researchers started to take up this concept as well as a proposition for a way to more proactively address issues of overtourism and move in a more dramatic direction. And this resulted in a sense of dramatic growth of publications about the relationship between tourism and degrowth right in the moment before the presentation. So here's just a selection of 4 different books that were all published in the years 2018 to 2020. Okay? And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden tourism growth was no longer a problem, and it switched to completely the opposite situation of what became called under-tourism. Okay? But up until this point, right, when people presented the idea that tourism growth was itself the issue that needed to be confronted, right, mainstream actors were very much opposed to this. So here's a very classic statement from the previous Secretary General of the World Tourism Organization in 2018 that says this quite explicitly, right? Growth is not the problem with tourism, right? Growing numbers are not the problem. It's how growth is managed. And this was very much kind of the mainstream party line in those years. Also through the report that we saw referenced earlier that the World Tourism Organization put out, looking at issues of over-tourism in destinations throughout Europe and proposing a set of alternatives. Okay? So this became, in a sense, the debate, right? Problems with growth, well, is the then solution then to move away from growth altogether, or is it simply to manage growth in such a way that problems can be avoided? Then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden this discussion disappeared, and we were confronted with the opposite problem of the consequences to destinations that had become dependent on tourism arrivals of the fact that no tourists were starting to appear. Okay? And of course, the same mainstream organizations that had been very much proponents of continued tourism growth responded to this, they were quite concerned, and their main response to this was essentially to demand more of the same, right? So the new UN Secretary General, who came in to replace the last one, very much vocal in the middle of the pandemic, of saying what we need to do is to re-stimulate tourism arrivals as soon as possible. The unprecedented decline having dramatic economic and social consequences, putting millions of jobs and businesses at risk. This underlines urgent need to safely restart tourism in a timely and coordinated manner. There was some lip service paid to the idea that this tourism regrowth, of course, need to be made sustainable, right? But this was quite concerning to a lot of us, that it didn't seem that that this moment of tourism slowdown would be taken advantage of in order to enact policies to proactively prevent the kind of problems that we had witnessed before, but instead would just be used as an argument for the fact that places dependent on tourism needed tourism to come back as quickly as possible. So this is kind of the larger context, and Amsterdam sits right in the middle of this because we can see this kind of same evolution of discussion happen within discussions of tourism development within the city in particular. So as a theoretical framework to analyze these changes, we have relied on the same typology that Macia talked about earlier that we developed in a previous publication, contrasting a series of D responses to issues of tourism growth, making the argument that simply by managing growth, we can make it more sustainable, right? Versus the more extreme argument that growth is itself the problem, and hence we need to move away from that in pursuit of a different tourism model, potentially guided by this alternative series of Ds, right? So we see dominant strategies to preserve growth, focus on deseasonalization, decongestion, a promotion of deluxe tourism, attempt to discredit contestation, or criticism of tourism, decentralization and diversification, and in the opposite direction, as Macia already mentioned. Degrowth proposes more radical shifts in the direction of decommodifying urban space, trying to reduce disparities and inequality, dignifying working conditions of people working in tourism and around it, reducing consumerism or putting sanctions on it, coupled with detailed spatial planning, but potentially the de-touristification of space altogether. So what we've done in this analysis is use this in a sense as a diagnostic framework to be able to analyze to what extent policies that are proposed or put into place either fall within this pro-growth discourse or move more in the direction of degrowth. And that's what I'll be trying to explain. All right, so this is based on two different field pieces of research that were conducted. The first before COVID came in 2018, a period of quantitative research that in some sense stands as a bit of a baseline, okay? Based on analysis of policy documents produced at the time, as well as interviews with government officials and other city planners, okay? And then a period of follow-up research conducted in 2021 that then looked at the new suite of policy documents being produced and went back to a lot of these same actors to again understand how things were changing in the meantime. So let's start with the pre-COVID situation, which in a lot of ways is summed up by this quotation from one of our interviewees. Right? Basically, the dominant approach was this: right? You can't put a fence around Amsterdam. Hence, trying to limit the amount of tourism arrivals is in some sense futile. Okay, and what you must do then is to manage the tourists that come in a more sustainable manner. Okay? But there was a lot of concern about the tourism growth, especially in the years between 2014 and 2018. And so the city responded to this by creating a campaign that they called the creation of city in balance, governed by these four overarching features: and more quality and diversity in the range of shops and facilities, moving away from shops, especially in the city center, that catered only to tourists. For instance, those that sell Nutella waffles, which you can find on virtually every corner. Reducing problem-setting boundaries, making better use of the city, raising profile of the region, creating more room on the streets in busiest areas. And this was enacted in a variety of different ways. One of the first, and I think the most useful things the city did, was they banned entirely the use of beer bikes. These very large bikes on which young groups of men sit and pedal and drink beer as they go down the city in the same spaces as all the bicycles that make very much use of the city. So that was one of their first moves. there are efforts to reduce the number of days that you could rent Airbnb, to try to ban the creation of new tourism shops, especially in the city center, and encourage tourists to start visiting areas outside of that center. One of the interesting ways they did this was by taking a beach called Zandvoort, which is about an hour away from the city, and they've been rebranding it as Amsterdam Beach in order to create the image that this is someplace quite close that you can go to, still be in Amsterdam, but not be in the city center as well. Okay? So a variety of different policies to spread tourists, to try to discourage or limit what are considered the most problematic tourists in the city, but not to limit tourism growth as a whole. There was also a campaign to try to curb tourists' what was considered inappropriate behavior. Things like this, especially the phenomenon that we call in the Netherlands wild being, right? By trying to let people know that there were significant sanctions that could be imposed for behaving in ways that created public nuisance. So this was the pre-pandemic response, very much resistant to the idea that you actually could limit tourism numbers, and more in terms of how you manage tourism in such a way that it wouldn't be such an impact on people who are living in the city. They were becoming quite concerned that their city was becoming a difficult place to live in. Okay? So if we think about this contrast between pro-growth and degrowth principles, we can say that the pre-COVID response to tourism issues was very much focused within this pro-growth discourse. Okay? And then COVID hit, and the situation changed dramatically. Okay? And right in the middle of the pandemic, the city administration that announced that they were going to implement a new form of spatial planning, of management for the city as a whole, grounded in the concept of donut economics. Okay? And then this would also be then applied to the tourism industry, and very dramatic controls would be placed on tourism regrowth at the end of the pandemic. And in order to support this, they created a new program. Okay? The previous campaign was called City Imbalance. The new campaign is called Tourism Imbalance. Okay? And contains a variety of different propositions for measures. They were initially proposed. They were subject to various rounds of public consultation, revised again, and have resulted in now a series of policies that have been put into place, but we're not sure exactly to what extent they're being enforced or what the consequences are. Okay? So in combination with the written documents, but also in interviewing a variety of different officials and other stakeholders involved in creating these documents, we were able to get a sense of kind of the dominant things that at least administrators think they're going to be trying to do as tourism numbers come back. Right? The first and foremost, which was emphasized a lot, was a focus on moving away from the type of tourism for which Amsterdam is most known internationally, essentially sex and drugs tourism, and focusing instead on cultural tourism. So the city, in a sense, wants to rebrand itself with the interest of attracting what are called, within the discourse, valuable visitors. Okay? And people are very consciously distinguishing valuable visitors from high-end tourists. Okay? And they make the argument that a tourist doesn't necessarily have to spend a lot of money to be a valuable visitor, right? It's the type of behavior that they engage in and the type of activities that they're interested in. Okay? And that they're happy to accept backpackers who don't spend much money, as long as they're also interested in becoming part of the cultural tourism that Amsterdam is trying to develop. Okay? So trying to essentially rebrand the city, right, in order to attract a different type of tourists with a different type of behavior. This is one of the policies. The second is raising the tourist tax, right, on international visitors. I think it's at around €3 at this point. There was a tax before the pandemic, but it was much lower than that. What's also being considered, though, is a tax on day trippers, right? Because one of the big tourist segments in Amsterdam are people who come from the rest of the country, right? But they're not subject to the same tourist tax if they don't stay overnight, right? So trying to find ways to also then generate revenue from tourists within the country who simply come for the day is another part of it. A third is continuing the same policy of spreading tourists throughout the country. The idea that there's much more to see within the city, other than just Amsterdam. There's also Amsterdam Beach, right? There's other places outside of the city. As a component of this program, it's a very controversial policy to relocate the red light district, okay, where sex workers are based outside of the city entirely. and create a so-called, in a sense, erotic enclave somewhere out in the countryside. This is being discussed right now, but we're not sure exactly how it's going to develop. Another aspect of these policies is a very kind of proactive regulation of the short-term rental sector. At this point now, there's an entire ban on Airbnb and other rentals within the city center. So that's a fairly dramatic move because Airbnb had proliferated quite dramatically before the pandemic. And whenever you talk to officials about the short-term rental sector, they use Airbnb as a shorthand for that, as in many places. These terms are relatively synonymous. Another thing that's being proposed right now is to try to then replace areas in the center that are dominated entirely by shops that sell souvenirs and other things to tourists, and instead replace this with what's being called a neighborhood economy, with shops that are interesting to residents as well, with the argument that those things will also then be interesting to tourists, and as a result, then you can have a more mixed economy in the center. At this point, like in many other places, during the high tourist season, the city center is entirely clogged with tourists, and if you're a local, you essentially try to maneuver your life around this city center, right, to the extent possible. So the idea of actually reinventing the city center as a space that locals will be able to frequent and want to frequent as well. But the final part of this proposal, and the most dramatic, is a cap on the number of visitors within the city. Right? And this is unprecedented. This is actually an ordinance that, in a sense, is legally binding. Okay? This was proposed in the middle of the pandemic lockdown, and at the height of things, the amount of the cap was actually quite low. They were proposing a cap of 11 million tourists per year. Okay? And considering that 20 million tourists had arrived before the year, that would be a fairly dramatic come down. But then this was subject to various rounds of public discussion and influence from lobbying groups, and the cap became continually lifted, and it now stands at 20 million tourists. Right? So the idea is that tourism will be allowed to come entirely to the same level that it existed before the pandemic, which of course had already been considered problematic, okay, but not allowed to move beyond that. Okay? And as part of this ordinance, there's a requirement that once tourism arrivals reach 18 million, that the city must intervene in order to keep numbers from exceeding this cap. On the other hand, nobody was able to give any concrete examples of what type of measures or policies would be put into place in order to enforce this measure. So in a sense, there's a legal mandate to keep tourism from exceeding 20 million visitors, but there are no actual kind of policy measures proposed or in place to keep this from happening. Okay, and so right now there are quite a lot of tourists returning to the city this summer and into the fall as well. We don't know exactly what those numbers are. We haven't heard anything about numbers starting to get close to this maximum, but it's very likely to happen in the future. And so how this ordinance will play out in practice is one of the very interesting to think about in the future. So very briefly, some kind of illustrations of how it is that people we talk to have described these different aspects of the new tourism and balance program. Focus on valuable visitors. One of the things that the city really wants to do is bring in more conferences, right, and conference visitors as alternative to party visitors. One informant said, yeah, Congress visitors stay for a few days, they go to a concert, go out for dinner, visit a museum, they have an extra day. So they are respectful visitors that we increasingly want to attract and for which we have to put in work. In relation to the tourist tax, as I mentioned, there's a consideration of actually trying to implement a tax not only on international overnight visitors, but on day trippers as well. Focus on spreading, of course, like in many places. Argument being that tourists don't know about facilities in other parts of the city, so they stay in the city center. Speaking as a resident in one of these other parts of the city where tourists don't visit, I'm not necessarily in favor of that spreading policy myself. In terms of the visitor economy, it's the argument that tourists themselves don't actually want all of these facilities that have been created specifically for them. Tourists don't want a street with just rubber ducks and weed lollipops. Right? Those are the kind of shops that you tend to see in the center. They want to travel to experience the unique identity of different cities. And so if we can provide a different type of tourist economy that also then caters to residents of the city, then the argument is that that will then also attract tourists too. And finally, in terms of this ordinance, the cap on tourism arrivals, this is very controversial, and a lot of officials that we talked to, other stakeholders, were very skeptical about it, okay, both in terms of its implementation, but also in terms of its enforcement. So again, the same kind of thing. Are you going to close the gates, right? You can't put a fence around the city. How are you actually going to enforce this? One of the issues that we have is that Amsterdam itself has no influence over the national airport, right, which delivers most of the tourists. The airport is regulated at the national level, right, even though it's very close to Amsterdam. And so the Amsterdam municipal officials don't have any influence over that, even though they would have some influence over who arrives by land or by water. That's not really up for discussion right now. A lot of people were skeptical about the reasons why this even came into place. They thought it was simply a political move by the current kind of left-leaning government in order to generate public support, but they didn't actually have any intention of enforcing it. So this is probably the most interesting component of the entire plan right now, but it's also the most controversial and the most ambiguous in terms of what it will actually mean. Okay? And there's also, of course, the question about to what extent a cap at 20 million tourists is really effectively addressing the issue when we had 20 million tourists before the pandemic, and that was already considered a significant problem. Okay? So as in many other places, there was a lot of discussion in the midst of the pandemic about being very proactive in terms of planning to keep problems from resurfacing, and over time, this seems to have shifted more and more into very kind of lukewarm, watered down ideas about how to, again, try to encourage tourism growth, but to keep it from becoming a significant problem. And in terms of the reason why these new proposals were put into place, why things have shifted, our research suggests that it's primarily due to economic considerations. Right? It isn't really a concern about the environmental impact of increasing tourism, and not so much even a response to the social concerns about the livability of the city that existed before. It's mostly a response to the fact that Amsterdam had become very dependent on tourism revenue, and when that revenue disappears, then that has a tremendous economic impact, and so the city is very concerned to put into place policies that will address that potential economic impact first and foremost. So it seems to be mostly an economic incentive that drives the policy changes to the extent that they have changed so far. So this is kind of qualitatively the new policies that are put into place. In terms of the conceptual framework grounding this analysis, we can say that in a sense there has been something of a shift from this overwhelming focus on retaining growth, but making it sustainable before the pandemic, towards at least some lip service to trying to rein in a growth and move, at least in some direction, of a post-growth situation after the pandemic. Okay? There's still a lot of focus on these conventional Ds, decongestion, promoting deluxe tourism, diversification, and also deseasonalization. They say now is there's really no tourist season anymore within Amsterdam, and the tourists come pretty much all year round. Okay, but there are some things that are starting to move in the direction of actually limiting tourists. There's a lot of discussion about especially how to increase the working conditions for sex workers, to move away from neighborhoods that are entirely focused on providing cheap souvenirs for tourists and develop more of a neighborhood economy that's to some extent less consumer-ified. There's a nod in the direction of more detailed social planning, a bit in terms of decommodification. Okay? So on the one hand, we think this is a very useful conceptual framework for taking any destination and asking what's happening now relative to what's happened before, and to use it as a way to develop, in a sense, a comparative analysis of the way in which policies are now responding to previous concerns about over-tourism. Okay? And also, in the specific case of Amsterdam, it demonstrates that there has been a bit of a shift away from the overwhelming pro-growth discourse that existed before, but not as much as many of us would have liked to have seen in the future. And as I mentioned before, most interesting will be to see how this visitor cap ordinance develops in the future, because I don't know of anything similar that's been proposed in other destinations that have been afflicted by over-tourism. So this will be, in a sense, a certain test case for how effective a policy like this can be. Right now, we're hoping to conduct a follow-up research as we start to get in numbers and reactions from this most recent tourist season in this past summer, and especially in terms of the effectiveness of this ordinance as we start to approach 20 million tourists again. All right, so a brief introduction to this case study, and happy to discuss aspects of it in the time we have at the end of this. Thank you.
Okay,